I mean, this is that which I and others have been saying is inevitable. I mean, this is the inevitable collapse of Ukraine. The Ukraine venture was unsustainable. Militarily, Ukraine simply can't slug it out with Russia. Uh, Even when backed by the material and financial assistance of Europe and the United States. We're now seeing Ukraine economically. It's a literal basket case. There is no functioning economy. It's all artificial, propped up, corrupt as the day is long. We see a very difficult winter approaching for Ukraine. Their energy infrastructure has been taken out. They're now going to the generator economy, which means that prices for everything, even under optimal conditions, will rise 20-25% this winter, and that's 20-25% in already dysfunctional, non-functioning economy. This will lead to political collapse, and we see that happening right now. I mean, all around Zelensky, the walls are falling. I don't know how much longer he can hold on, if he's capable of holding on. If people want him to hold on, he was always a figurehead around which different power structures were constructed, and we see now one of the big power structures, the air power structure, totally collapse, and there's really nothing to replace it. And then we layer on top of that just the fact that Europe is just 100% dysfunctional when it comes to Ukraine. All talk, no action. They're incapable of any real action. I'm not worried about any escalation from Europe because they can't escalate. They have nothing to escalate with. So it comes down to the United States managing the fall of Ukraine, and this, in the end, is what we're witnessing here. Is this a helping hand, or is this a euthanasia? We don't know exactly what's happening right now. One thing we do know is that Russia's in the catbird seat here. They're driving this. All they have to do is sit back and literally point to the scoreboard. Anytime the United States hesitates, tries to play tough with sanctions, just point to the scoreboard, because Russia just keeps scoring every day more and more, and there's nothing left for the Ukrainians. So we're approaching total collapse of the military, and when that happens, it's over. It's unconditional surrender. And so the United States, in many ways, it's a race against the clock to see if they can get Ukraine to agree to something that allows something called Ukraine that isn't totally controlled by Russia to exist, or if Russia just gets everything at once. I believe so. I mean, I don't have proof to this. This is purely speculation on my part. But the United States tolerated Ukrainian corruption, encouraged Ukrainian corruption. Some could say benefited from Ukrainian corruption. So long as Ukraine was able to deliver the goods on the battlefield to have a robust defense, carry out counter offenses on call, invade Kursk, all these things. The United States held their nose. I mean, it was so blatantly obvious when Congress would not even allow auditing mechanisms to be put in place because they know the truth. The truth has been known from day one that Ukraine is fundamentally corrupt from the top to the bottom. There's no aspect of Ukraine that's not corrupt. Even the anti-corruption forces, they don't work for Ukraine. They appear to have been, constructed at the behest of the United States as a mechanism of control, according to Ukrainian telegram channels. You could take that as a grain of salt, but historically, they've actually, I wouldn't quote them, except that historically they've been fairly accurate in reading the tea leaves of Ukrainian politics and calling things out. They say things, and then a couple weeks later, it turns out what they said was true. So they say that that the NABU, the anti-corruption organ, has the goods not just on Yermak but on Zelensky. That they have his voice knee deep in this current, Machinik, or whatever the guy's name is, Michnuk corruption scheme. But we've known this. I mean, that's why this isn't a shock. We know that they take a cut of everything, that this is how they stay in power. This is how they build, power structures. This is how you build your allies. It's your ability to funnel money into their pockets for the ability to get contracts to them. The many of these contracts is the equivalent of mafia, no-show jobs. You want to do construction in Brooklyn, well, then you got to fund 50 jobs. 40 of them people will show up. 10, nobody shows up. You're just paying for 10 bodies that the mafia pockets it. And that's how Ukraine has been functioning from day one. It's not a surprise to anybody. So for corruption suddenly to become an issue, means that somebody wanted it to become an issue. There's only one nation in the world that has that kind of power over Ukraine. That's the United States. So I do believe that this is a mechanism of pressuring Zelensky, manipulating the system. And if I was a Ukrainian, understand every single one of them is corrupt. There's not a clean person there. Everybody on that negotiating table is owned by the United States. When we decide to make them fall, they will collapse like a house of cards. That's my take on it. It's British driven. I mean, let's just be honest here when we're talking about Ukrainian, naval drones. This is a 100% British driven operation. And it's the Brits have been, doing this for quite some time. And there's real danger in this. The attack by a Ukrainian drone on the Russian oil tanker. This is going to have been an act of war if executed properly, where Ukraine is officially recognized. But Ukraine isn't recognized. The people in charge of Ukraine aren't recognized. The people executing this aren't wearing uniforms. This is, de facto the actions of illegal combatants who, if captured, will probably be treated as such. But the bottom line is Britain is engaging in acts of piracy. I think the Russians should take action to eliminate the British capability. But, it is an attack on a sovereign Russian ship in international waters. Fortunately, the ship was not destroyed. Otherwise, I think this would have led to Russian attacks on British naval platforms involved in this attack. But the Brits are playing with fire. So I do expect something will happen eventually. It won't be good for British forces, but the Russians are not going to tolerate this forever. This is why we see so much investment in hypersonic missiles, because the Russians are going to reach that point where they just tire of playing nice and will hit, what they consider to be legitimate military targets that support illegal operations being carried out by Ukraine. Yes. There is no Ukraine politically. What you have is fragmented power structures that the United States has attempted through Zelensky to unify under one umbrella. Power abhors a vacuum. So, if you have American authority with Zelensky, and it's absolute, then that's who you negotiate with. But Zelensky's power has always been negotiable, and now it's increasingly eroded. So we could find ourselves in a situation similar to what Syria was looking like towards the end of the conflict, where suddenly, in Adara, where you had, 50 commanders all trying to negotiate individual deals with Russia. Russia doesn't want that in Ukraine. They want one group to come forward, to surrender, to negotiate. And so what we're hoping to do is create American-backed Ukrainian opposition, if you will, that's unified, that can be a negotiating partner with Russia. I don't know what the word is. Maybe there is an acceptable figure in Ukraine that would be tolerated by the Russians. But I also think this goes back to presidential elections in Russia, and even the United States. The United States could be making decisions about Ukraine that end up being contradictory to what, domestic politics required of them. If, for instance, before the Russian presidential election, Russia makes a significant move to try to end the conflict, that'll be a very popular move inside Russia. And Putin, who I believe is probably is the one of, if not the most popular political leaders around the world today, and he would, it would only add to his credibility if he were to do this. If the United States accepted it, it will be problematic for them. But these presidential elections and politics do come into play. It's hard for me to speculate exactly how this will play out. But I do believe that both sides recognize the need for this to end. You can call it stalemate. If Russia doesn't want to continue it and the United States doesn't want to continue it, you can call that stalemate. But really, the war has been won. It's just a matter now of ending the conflict. But war is an extension of politics by other means. I mean, that's, old Clausewitz there. We could also, I'm sure Sun Tzu said something similar at some point in time in his many pronouncements about war and politics. Um, we have to be careful in thinking solely militarily. I mean, because, yeah, I mean, it's very tempting right now because we've reached the culminating point where Russia now will be able to militarily accomplish things that up until now they haven't been able to. I mean, Odessa is within reach. It's not inconceivable. There's nothing in Karen right now. If the Russians collapse the Zaporozhye front and come in and cross the Dnieper River in strength, and then they decide to pivot south, the right bank of Karos will fall along with Mikv, and then they're at the doorstep of Odessa, and nothing can stop them. But now, there's been some frustration expressed in certain circles about Vladimir Putin's lack of, killer instinct. Why hasn't he decapitated, Vankova? Well, because he thinks bigger than you simply decapitating. Remember what came before the special military operation is the Russian draft treaty for European security framework. Russia's thinking in the long term what's in its best interest. And right now, if Russia can secure the four territories that it claims because of the September 2022 referendum and here's an important thing, and get the United States and Europe to recognize these as Russian territories, if they can end the sanctions that are linked to Crimea in this and normalize economic relations with the world. Contrast that with winning military, seizing Odessa, maybe even getting Carlo, but nobody in the world will recognize this. And along with that, nobody recognizes, and it's a forever situation where sanctions are going to cost you trillions of dollars over the course of the next decade. Strategically, where do you go? And I've just been impressed with Russia's ability to think past the glory and think strategically about where it needs to be down the road. BRICS doesn't function well with one of its members in a permanent state of economic conflict with the West. That's not for a healthy BRICS. And Russia wants BRICS to succeed. Russia wants to be part of BRICS. And the best way that Russia integrates into BRICS is to be a fully functioning nation state with an economy that can be plugged in anywhere in the world, especially with the United States and China simultaneously. So I still believe that Russia's looking for an off ramp. There is a negotiation there. It's a fine balance. It'll be interesting to see about elections. Because the United States, again, there's some fascinating things going on behind the scenes, unspoken things, the kind of stuff where two people sit at a table and sort of look at each other and give that nod, like, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. We're not going to say it right. We don't need to say it. And what I mean by this is the United States, it appears that we're moving towards a total redefinition of what Ukrainian government looks like to break these power structures that have held Ukraine together since it became an independent state. Why would we do that? Why would we break everything and reform something to benefit Ukrainian democracy? It doesn't exist. The Russians, on the other hand, are sitting there with a government and waiting. They have a plan, they have a vision. It'll be difficult for the Russians to slide in if they have to slide into the old traditional corrupt structures that exist, because Russia doesn't readily integrate into that. But if you break that and you create something new through this peace process, Russia slides in, and Russia therefore doesn't need to occupy Odessa, doesn't need to occupy Cargo. What they do is they give Ukraine options, one for Ukraine to become part of the Union state, and then Ukraine is like Belarus, visa-free travel. Why? It's a R. Odessa will be a Russian city. It'll be governed by Ukraine, but it'll be a Russian city. It's visa-free travel. The Russians will now come in. They'll be rebuilding everything. They'll own all of Ukraine. Ukraine will be called Ukraine, but it'll be functioning as a de facto extension of Russia. I think that's the Russian vision, and they can get to that through a semblance of a peace deal. That's a more realistic vision than the one of Europe, retaining Ukraine that can forever strike Russia. But if Russia moves too fast, militarily seeks to, do too much, they spoil that, because then what happens is everybody becomes defensive. Russia has to be careful not to be that which Europe accuses them of being, and, a Pelmy rush to occupy territory, to seize territory, to be seen as seeking to grab all of Ukraine. I think Russia would prefer to avoid that. The other thing is it will require more manpower. I mean, the bottom line is, the Russians now have manpower that can take them a certain distance, but to go even further, you're going to need to mobilize additional manpower. I don't think Putin wants to do that. I think the economy right now is geared to be able to sustain at the present rate another year or two of this kind of activity. But to mobilize even more manpower will put strain on the economy. Where's that manpower going to come from? From defense industry jobs, or are you going to weaken the civilian, economic structure so that we start to see collapse of the civilian economy that now has to be propped up at expense and harm to the Russian economy? I think the Russians right now are working with the Trump administration to find a balance that gives Russia everything it wants, but also creates opportunities for Russia going forward that don't require the military to be flexing its muscle. And this is where again the Russians, people are just fundamentally ignorant about Russia and what's going on in Russia. Is I've had the honor and privilege of being able to go into Russia and talk to these people, and you speak to them and you see that there are things happening that the West just either ignores or just isn't aware. There is significant philosophical dialogue going on in Russia about the future of Ukraine. And how to deal with Ukraine that goes far beyond the notion of, killing banderists and conquering territory. It's a far more sophisticated philosophical, ethical approach to conflict resolution than anybody in the West gives Russia credit for.